The moment that comics grew up. A #1 New York Times bestseller and one of Time magazine's best novels of all time. A cornerstone of comic book literature. These are just a few of the many accolades that float around the seminal comic, Watchmen. Usually buzzwords like that make me want to roll my eyes. They don't really mean much to me. But in this case, I have to agree. Watchmen is the best comic that I've ever read. I think everyone and their mom knows how influential this comic book was and how it changed the game. Without Watchmen, the medium might not be what it is today. It brings so much to the forefront by examining superheroes, society, and human nature. It was such a ballsy comic at the time, and it's still pretty ballsy. I think it was one of the first comic books that I was really into. A lot of the social commentary went over my head back then, but this is a perfect time to revisit. Let's go ahead and take a look at what makes Watchmen so good. So before we talk about the story, I wanted to talk about the minds behind it. Most people are probably familiar with Alan Moore as the writer, but I feel like a lot of people don't give enough credit to the likes of Dave Gibbons and John Higgins. These guys are like peanut butter and jelly. Alan Moore's writing perfectly complements Gibbons and Higgins' art. Right on the first page, it is dripping with cinematic storytelling. Gibbons' style is fairly simple, but it really works. I get a little bit of Mobius vibes with the hatching on the artwork. Higgins also does a tremendous job here as a colorist. Most of the colors are flat, but it speaks volumes to how good of a colorist he is, considering he can really bring out the emotions in a scene. There's clearly a lot of deep thought when it comes to using the colors here. For example, the first pages during the comedian's murder, he uses a bunch of red and orange during the scene. Now we're going to actually get into the story of Watchmen. It all stems from a pretty simple concept of a murder, one that involves a former masked hero named the Comedian. Right off the bat, we're introduced to the brutality of the world in Watchmen. It's a very bleak reimagining of what the world would be like if America had won the Vietnam War after superheroes came into existence. Watchmen takes the idea of superheroes very seriously and literally. It asks the question, what if superheroes really existed? Alan Moore thought that if such people were to exist, that there would be a lot of psychological problems with those people. As we are introduced to several of our main characters, we can see that these people are deeply troubled and have questionable traits. Our main character here, Rorschach, is nutty and has a variety of strange views on the world. He ends up warning a lot of the other heroes who aren't seemingly any better. The idea of superheroes not being the best people isn't really a new concept to a lot of people thanks to shows like The Boys, but this popularized the idea for sure. Even before Alan Moore conceived Watchmen, there were other comic books that took a jab at the idea, like Rick Veitch's The One. So Chapter 1 mainly serves the purpose of introducing our main characters, but Alan Moore makes it so interesting with his dialogue and his unique take on our superheroes. This is Alan Moore at his best for me personally. We've only covered the first chapter and we're left with a bunch of dense stuff and a lot of questions. This has to be one of the best openings for a comic book ever. It's pretty hard for me to pick my favorite chapter out of Watchmen, but if I had to choose, it would probably be this one. It mainly centers around the comedian and how much of an evil piece of shit he is. We already got the idea that these people are dysfunctional, but this is next level. It literally opens with Lori's mom just shrugging off the fact that Blake tried to rape her, followed by a flashback of that happening. Blake is such a despicable person. Arguably, one of the worst things that he does is kill a woman that he was responsible for impregnating. Dr. Manhattan is present throughout the whole thing and does nothing to prevent him from doing this. He stands over the woman's body in an indifferent and stoic way, the same way he looks at Blake as he sits in his grave. Another flashback occurs where we see one of the most famous panels that features a piece of graffiti that says, "Who watches the Watchmen?" This phrase actually has its roots all the way back to Latin as it was coined by the poet Juvenal. The meaning behind it is how or who keeps people in charge accountable for their actions. The quote is preceded by the comedian shooting tear gas into an open crowd. It's a very ironic moment, and it's unfortunately a quote that it's too relevant in today's world. This is a question that a lot of people throughout history have asked themselves, and in Watchmen, those fears come to light. We also briefly take a step back into Rorschach's shoes as he interrogates a former villain known as Moloch. This is where we get to see Blake at his lowest, with a flashback displaying him drunkenly rambling to Moloch weeks before his death. It's pretty hard to feel bad for the guy, but I think this is where we start seeing that tough guy act broken down, and we see what a sad and broken person he is. The whole sequence is geniusly presented with the coloring, going back between yellows and reds to cool blues and purple. It perfectly conveys his broken mind, before it cuts to a close-up of Blake grabbing Moloch. Then it moves to present day with Rorschach doing the same to Moloch. Rorschach seems to be the only person who cares about Blake's death. Laurie doesn't care for obvious reasons, and Dr. Manhattan is there just because he's forced to be. Everyone else seems a little upset, but they don't really care. Rorschach seems to think that Blake was some type of great man, even after everything he's done, which says a lot about Rorschach's flawed character. He even gives a passionate speech at the end about Blake and his misfortunes. It makes sense to me that someone as deranged as him would support someone like that. In the Watchmen universe, being a superhero comes with a lot of issues. Outside of fighting crime, they struggle a lot with relationships. This was already evident within the first chapter, but in chapter 4, we take a deeper look into Dr. Manhattan and Laurie's relationship. The thing about Dr. Manhattan is he's not really an average person, in case you can't tell. He's really the only current member of the Watchmen with superpowers. While in most superhero relationships, close ones may find out about their identity and powers and stick by them. However, in Dr. Manhattan's case, this only serves as a point of contention between him and Laurie. Manhattan has the power of a god, and this renders him completely unrelatable to anyone around him. It's no wonder he ends up being such a stoic and emotionless individual. Regardless of who he surrounds himself with, he finds himself alone. It's even worse as news eventually breaks out that many people who are close to him have developed types of cancer. You mean being around the guy who's radiating blue skin is a bad idea? Who would have thought? Through this, we can see Alan Moore's fear of nuclear energy. This is something that has been a staple of his work since Swamp Thing. There's an arc in Swamp Thing that's kind of similar where a woman ends up sleeping with a man who's been irradiated by nuclear power. It's easy to forget how scary nuclear devastation could be in modern day life, but events like the Cold War, in which there was a nuclear arms race, there was a massive fear of these things. It's riddled throughout Watchmen in the narrative and the art. I would also like to praise the layout in this issue and its usage of the dual narrative. When Laurie leaves Dr. Manhattan, we get to this brilliant segment as it shifts back and forth between her perspective and Dr. Manhattan's. It captures the split between the characters, and the way that it's interwoven is so brilliant. It's a big reason why Watchmen is one of the best comics ever. There's so much thought poured into everything. Most comics don't even think of stuff like this. This is also where we get introduced to another dual narrative throughout the story called the Black Freighter. It mainly parallels a lot of our characters' lives, and it sort of came out of accident when Moore thought about what type of comics that people in that world would read. They eventually decided to use pirates and put it in the story. We'll talk more about the significance later, but for now, we're moving onward. Dr. Manhattan is a character that's always stuck with me. From a personality standpoint, I've always related to him, but he also has some of the most profound moments in literature history. Chapter 4 delves deep into not only his backstory, but the psyche of him as well. What started off as an intelligent young man turned into an apathetic shell of his former self. Things did seem okay for a while after he returned, but his character takes a pretty dark turn when he realizes that he can see the future. How fitting for a former watchmaker to end up being able to see through time itself. Being able to skim through your future, and especially knowing how dark it turns out, would shake most people to their core. I think the only possible way for him to withstand it is to build indifference to it, otherwise he would be crazy. He technically has the power to change every bad event in history, and chooses not to. Some may view this as a moral failing on his part, but consider how hard it is to be in his position. If you could change history, who knows what might change and what might stay the same? Not saying he's a very moral person, obviously. He cheated on his wife, and does some weird things with Silk Spectre. There's an interesting line that John says about his life being constantly pushed around by somebody else, be it his father or otherwise. John has been dealt an unfair hand in life with his father pushing him to atomic sciences. He really didn't have much of a choice in that decision. This moves the gears in life much in the same vein as clockwork. Once those gears have started turning, however, there's no stopping them. If his father didn't push him into science, he would have never met Janie, and he wouldn't have been turned into ash, and so on and so on. This is something that he ponders at the end of the chapter. Is he really the one holding the cards of fate in his life, or is it somebody else? He's viewing his life through a deterministic lens here. I think his indifference to things is sort of understandable from that viewpoint. Being isolated by everyone around you for your powers and your differences would be rather difficult. If you think of it like that, he probably has one of the worst fates imaginable out of all the Watchmen. I think he perfectly encapsulates the dangers of having such powers and the realities of what a superhero would actually be like in the real world. The aftermath of Dr. Manhattan is an event that lifts the veil and exposes the people of the Watchmen universe to reality. Unfortunately for them, it's not a pleasant one. His absence is definitely felt in this issue as the newspaper headlines grow increasingly more concerning and panic set throughout the chapter. It literally opens with a man slaughtering 2 children out of fear for the war. Interestingly enough, there is a lot of imagery with Eastern religions in this chapter. You'll notice the Buddha poster brought up twice in the story, and then there's a bunch of Egyptian architecture in Adrian's tower. At this point, Adrian brings up that Egyptians didn't find the idea of death morbid, but as a way of spiritual discovery. This happens seconds before one of his assistants is gunned down as they discuss the possibilities of war. Alan Moore is quite an eccentric guy, and clearly he is fascinated by different types of religions. I think that there's more symbolism behind this, however. This might be a bit of a reach because I don't know much about Egyptian religions, but I feel like there's an overlap in the way that religions are featured in Watchmen. In Buddhism, they teach that ignorance is the root of all suffering, and then take into account what the Egyptians think of death. Lastly, think about what the assistant says about not wanting to engage in spiritual discovery. It's very ignorant of her to say that, before reality slaps her in the face. If I haven't lost you yet, what I'm trying to get at is that some of the people in Watchmen are living under the guise of ignorance. They think that they're invincible. The assistant is just one example of that, but it reflects the attitude of the time period that Watchmen came out. Alan Moore has stated on occasion that Watchmen was how he went after Reagan America. He thought that they had their heads in the clouds, and they thought that they were invincible. Watchmen shows them the devastation possible when power runs out of hand and the dangers of a political climate. This perfectly parallels our poor lone sailor in the Black Freighter. Reality comes hurling down on him with no means of escape. I gotta say that reading the Black Freighter this time is much more interesting. When I was a teenager trying to read this, I usually just skipped the Black Freighter segments. I thought that they were boring and slowed down the pace. But after seeing how well it comes together with this narrative, it makes me realize that I was sleeping on it. It also parallels with Rorschach in the segment at the end when he finally gets caught by the police. It reminds me of the sailor getting surrounded by the sharks. You could say that the sailor has his illusions of the raft destroyed by the sharks, while Rorschach has his face, or mask, forcibly removed by the police. Under all that anger and intimidation lies a broken, sad mess of a man, and we'll be diving more into this can of worms in the next chapter. Okay, time to open the can of worms. So about this Rorschach guy. Watchmen is one of the most beloved comic books ever, but it's also quite controversial. And a lot of that is owed to this guy right here. In recent years, I've seen people online argue over whether or not he's an outright hero. And I'm going to try to give a fair and balanced take here. So this Rorschach guy, he's a pretty scary person, right? He's got a very cool and iconic design and has a lot of cool moments. But, and this is a big but, he is in no way a hero. A lot of people think this because he prattles on about justice and is by far the most proactive character in the bunch. But if you dig a little deeper, you start seeing the cracks in his personality. The first one is his worship over the comedian, who acts in horrendous ways that are hard to defend. I think that says a lot about Rorschach as a person. Speaking of the comedian, in the first chapter, he completely brushes off the fact that the comedian tried to rape someone, citing it as a moral lapse in a great man, which is quite odd and doesn't really fit in with the whole hero and justice thing. He's a hypocrite too. It's perfectly fine when someone he likes and agrees with does it, but when it happens to the woman Kitty, it's a problem. He doesn't even follow his black and white moral code that much. At the end of chapter 6, he also goes into this nihilistic speech, which is on par with the comedian's ideology, and I'm supposed to believe this guy's a hero? No. In fact, almost all of the Watchmen are not heroes or good people. That's the point behind Watchmen. It's a critique of superheroes and people with power. It shows a lot more of a realistic and flawed side of people if they were placed in such a position. However, I don't think that doesn't mean that you can't like the character. He's very well written and complex, like all the characters in Watchmen. I like his character, but I don't really like him as a person. I'm not saying that you can't like his character, but he has way too many flaws to be considered a good person. It's really the same logic that you could apply to villains. You may like their character, and they may be well written, but that doesn't mean you agree with their methods. Moving on to the actual substance of the chapter, it's a fascinating look back at what made Korvac, or should I say Rorschach, himself. His exchanges with the therapist are some of my favorite in the entire novel. It's really interesting how Rorschach kind of reads him and ends up rubbing off on him. He starts off as a very naive and optimistic person, but by the end of the chapter, he's left just as disturbed as Rorschach. Hence the title, The Abyss Gazes Back, which is not the only quote taken from Nietzsche in this. At the end, we also get the classic quote about becoming a monster while as fighting monsters, which perfectly ties into the therapist situation and most of the characters in the story as well. The majority of the Watchmen are pretty fucked in the head. Rorschach and the comedian are insane, and Dr. Manhattan is an apathetic shell of a human being. That leaves us with Lori and Dan, which Chapter 7 covers. It's probably the most normal and healthy interaction that we've seen between two people so far. It's a nice breath of fresh air, but their interactions are not nearly as interesting as other members of the Watchmen. It's not really their fault of their own, but everyone around them is so much more interesting. The weirdest thing about them is their strange obsession with their costumes, and unironically listening to Devo. It would have been really nice if we got chapters that went into their background, but that doesn't really happen. Alan Moore actually ended up with less issues at the beginning before he decided to go back and expand the backstories of the characters. And I'm really glad that he did, because I don't think Watchmen would be as well remembered without his expanding on Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan. We don't get this for Lori or Dan, so it feels a little bit unbalanced, but not every character needs to have a tragic backstory in the same vein of Rorschach. Actually, I think it'd be rather boring if all the characters were completely fucked up. It's nice to have some sane ones in there to break up the monotony. This is probably my least favorite chapter so far, but you have some nice parts in it too, like getting to hear Dan's perspective on Rorschach. It's really interesting that the two of them used to work together, considering they're basically complete opposites now. That's really all that stuck out to me about this chapter. After some downtime, we finally get an action-packed chapter here. Panic continues to grow throughout the city as the threat of nuclear devastation grows more prominent. The jailbreak sequence is a really cool and exciting segment. I think another problem with Rorschach is that Alan Moore kind of miscalculated by giving him cool moments like this. If he wanted the audience to dislike him more, he should have made him less competent or take it out on more innocent people. Maybe even give somebody else this moment like Night Owl or someone else. Speaking of Night Owl, I kind of felt bad when Hollis ended up dying by the end here. Basically, nothing good happens in this chapter. It's a downer of a chapter, but that's just keeping up the trend. It also continues to get darker in the Black Freighter, with our protagonist uttering the phrase, "Life is hell." We're starting to see a complete societal breakdown as violence breaks out across the board. Before getting ahead of myself, I've never actually finished reading Watchmen. I believe it's always been around this chapter or the next one that I eventually stopped. I'm not sure why, but I'm kicking myself for not continuing it earlier. So I take back what I said about chapter 7 because we do get to spend more time with Lori, and her backstory is way more interesting than I gave it credit for. The reveal of the comedian ending up being her father just floored me when I read it. It's very gripping and truly one of the most shocking moments in Watchmen. The main point of this chapter, though, is to settle the conflict between her and John. It goes about as well as one would expect, with John being cold and rational to the point of not understanding why he should help the planet. John looks at everything through this detached and clinical view of the world, while Laurie speaks from a more sentimental way. It's really hard to pick a side in the matter. Both of them make very valid points, but both of their perspectives are also heavily biased. They're both stuck in their own little world formed by their experiences and traumas. They are the opposite of each other, but eventually they end up seeing eye to eye when John realizes that there is some amount of miracle to existence. It's still kind of concerning that he views it through such a detached lens, but that's the only way that you're really going to get through to him. Overall, it's just a fascinating look at two tortured souls and their complex relationship with each other. Rorschach and Night Owl are back together again and have some violent exchanges with criminals like you'd expect, but there are some surprisingly human moments as well. When Rorschach returns to his apartment, he runs back into his landlady. Besides the name calling, of course, you can see the pity in his eyes as he looks down to one of their children, probably reminded of his childhood. Then there's also another touching moment with Night Owl where he argues with Rorschach about how hard it is to be his friend. Rorschach actually apologizes for once and says that he knows it's hard being his friend. Although moments like Rorschach's backstory are sad, moments like these are a bit sadder. Rorschach didn't initially start out with terrible motives, but like Dan says, time ate away at him. Alan Moore beautifully wrote scenes like this, and understood that it was important to make them nuanced characters. I imagine many other writers would make him a one-dimensional stand-in for right-wingers, but there's way more depth thanks to Moore. There's also an interesting turn of events in The Black Freighter, where it seems our main character is seeking some type of revenge, and commits a grisly murder as he finally drifts ashore. He's completely consumed by pain and madness at this point and just goes nuts. The last thing that really stuck out about this issue was the reveal of Adrian being the one that's pulling the strings. Now, I've already had this thing spoiled to me very long ago, and it took away the impact behind this moment. It seems like he has some type of connection to the island, and I don't know if anyone else gets like Epstein Island vibes from this thing. It seems like it's occupied with high status and rich people, and there's a list involved too. It's really creepy how close things in Watchmen encroach on reality. Everything in this world fits together except for people. So many different races, sexualities, and nationalities, along with a society that is intolerant to the even slight difference. To this day, the idea of world peace seems so far out of reach. So maybe it's best to bring people together through other means, like a giant fucking alien bomb thing. At least this is how Adrian hopes to accomplish this Gordian knot situation. So this is where we learn more about Adrian as a person, and he's a pretty weird dude. For some reason, he's always had some fascination with Alexander the Great, and feels the need to one-up him. I honestly think he's kind of underwhelming as the big bad. He's just kind of a mildly weird person who hyperfixated on Alexander, I guess. His plot seems a little convoluted as well. I understand what he's trying to do, though. I sympathize with Moore because this was probably a pretty difficult story to wrap up. The Black Freighter also wraps up in this chapter as well, and ends with the sailor running into the ship again. There are multiple ways that you could interpret the Black Freighter. I've seen some argue it's tying in with the theme of becoming the darkness that you fight against. That makes the most sense to me, but Alan Moore has also stated that the Black Freighter strongly resembles Adrian's story the most out of everyone in Watchmen. The Mariner uses dead bodies to get to his goal, much like Adrian is willing to sweep all of his comrades under the bus. It's a very desperate attempt to try to escape a grim fate. He's killing millions of people to save billions of people. It's like the trolley question, with more steps. It's not really a pleasant position to be in for either party, but it's one that Adrian feels like he has to do. The final chapter opens up with the results of the attack, and it's horrifying to look at. Bodies piled everywhere, and there's also a scary surreal element with the creature there as well. So far, Watchmen has been fairly grounded, as it can be, but then this alien Cthulhu-looking creature shows up. It honestly feels kind of wacky, but if you can believe Dr. Manhattan, then this should be okay too. Now, the ending itself feels awful because no one really wins in this scenario. There's the implication that this also isn't going to be the end of this situation, as it's stated not only by Dr. Manhattan, but one of the people from the News Frontiersman finds Rorschach's journal. It's also interesting as the kid working there looks like a fat version of Rorschach as well. Makes you wonder if he'll end up in a similar situation like Rorschach. I didn't expect most of the characters to survive in the ending, though. I did have Rorschach's death spoiled to me, and it's an interesting turn of events. I do understand where he's coming from, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because they end up finding his journal. At the end of the day, nobody really learned anything more than what they started with. It's really telling how Dan and Lori immediately start making love after all the horror they witnessed. They go right back to their apathy, and this level of apathy is part of the reason to blame for the events of Watchmen taking place in the first place. I will say the ending is good, but I have been left with this empty feeling after reading it. There really isn't any piece of media like Watchmen out there. It's drenched with philosophical depth and symbolism. It really is the Moby Dick of comic books, and it's unfortunately done a lot of damage in its wake. Alan Moore has been burned by Watchmen over the years. Watchmen also left a mere dent in the industry, as Moore claims comic books haven't really grown up at all. They have a lot of the set dressing as Watchmen, but not the amount of thought or skill behind it. It's honestly really depressing to have something so influential and well written and seeing it barely make any difference. I think a lot of people read Watchmen and saw the violence and sex, and that's what they stayed for. Watchmen has so much more to say, and it's not even that hard to see. It's frustrating because the comic book medium could be even better than what it is today if people actually learn from Watchmen. If more books had this type of substance and the pull of Watchmen, the industry would be very different today. However, we can only imagine because a book like Watchmen only comes around every once in a while.